Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to the Sweet Nothings podcast. My name is Kelly, and if you don't already know, this is your home of relaxed, funny, and informative chats all about the love of eating. We'll talk about the latest food trends, controversial opinions, and all things edible. The legal kind. I've already made that joke too many times. Going by the title of today's podcast, whether you are listening on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or any of the funky, more indie versions, or whether you are watching on YouTube, obviously this title is a little bit heavier than some we have used in past. But before we get into the kind of main topic of today, which I hope I will make less grim than it sounds, let's touch on the utter chaos in terms of the food world that we've been experiencing throughout the month of August and a little bit of the start of September of 2021, because I know I can't believe we're this far into the year either. So let's get into our food trends of the last 30 days. Now, I am jumping onto this one a little bit late because it was mostly a thing around the start of August, but just in case you missed it, of course, the platform that sets food trends like no other these days is, of course, TikTok, an app I have a love-hate relationship with, mostly love because it takes up so much of my time, which I fully enjoy, whether it's doing my attention span any good or not. And for some reason that remains blissfully unknown to me, the main trend we've been seeing over the past month has been frozen honey. Stay with me. Of course, we have now reached the point where the trend is dying down and news sites picked up on it. Other platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram have picked up on it. But for some reason, some teenagers, some TikTokers decided to freeze whole bottles of honey. This is the squeezy kind. So the runny honey that you would kind of squeeze out of a bottle rather than the more traditional jar or the set honey that you can get in several countries, including the UK. And for some reason, people have been sticking these in the freezer because honey, for whatever reason, I'm guessing because of its sugar content or just perhaps the enzymes in it, I'm not entirely sure, but it doesn't kind of freeze solid. Almost like if you, not to the extent that if you were to put a bottle of vodka in the freezer and that it doesn't freeze because of the alcohol content, but it doesn't go solid. So when this honey comes out of the freezer, people have been screwing off the squeezy lid and they've been able to squeeze out almost solid tubes, like thick, sticky sausages of honey that they then just bite straight into. And I'm someone who's been fortunate with my teeth throughout my lifetime, right? And I still get shudders from my molars to the base of my spine watching this. I'm sure many of you are the same, if you've ever had any dental work done, if you've ever had braces, when you see young people just absolutely obliterating their dentine with this, it just makes me want to curl up and pass away. But it's been quite interesting to see the texture that this honey comes out at. And even funnier than that has been seeing people's response. Obviously, we think of honey as a sweetener, just something sugary. I don't think a lot of people ever really eat honey in a quantity where they notice how strong its flavour can be. The cheap stuff, not so much, but if you're buying floral honey, blossom honey, heather honey, if you're here in Scotland, that stuff is strong and for good reason is not designed to be consumed by the sausage full. So most of the videos of people eating it to try it out end with them being utterly disgusted, spitting it out, or not realising what honey actually tasted like, which has been very amusing. It's not a trend I'll be taking part in, which I feel like I say every single month. I'm starting to sound more and more like someone's elderly uncle, but this is one that, as much as I have enjoyed watching the reactions, and it is a lot more kind of wholesome and science experiment-like than some of the other tragic food trends we've seen this year, it's definitely one I wouldn't recommend to you, your children, or your teeth. You're listening to the Sweet Nothings podcast. If you want more recipes, food reviews, and knowledge on all things edible, you can find it at maverickbaking.com and at Maverick Baking on YouTube. In terms of food trends, there hasn't really been much else going on over the summer, or at least nothing to the extent of the kind of feta pasta that we had earlier in the year. But the food news has actually been quite heavy this month. In the UK, particularly, without wishing to delve into politics here, that's not the purpose of this podcast, and we are all too tired to even care at this point. So essentially, while we had been warned a long time ago about how tariffs and trade laws and regulations would change as the effects of Brexit began to unfold, the UK supply chain for feeding supermarkets and restaurants and bars has started to finally be affected. Food safety checks, regulations, paperwork, and things like that are leading to potential shortages and some already existing shortages within the UK food supply. Now, many of us are in the wonderfully privileged position that, our stores are still stocked enough that we haven't really noticed that much, but there have been effects on alcohol, there have been effects on lorry shipments or, lorry drivers even, and of course there's been the knock-on effect that we started to see throughout the summer of the fact that fruit picking and farmhand labour has been severely affected by Brexit as well. From the 1st of October, this is supposedly set to become even more tricky, and there have been warnings that there could be Christmas food shortages and all sorts. Obviously, I have no professional opinion on this. I have no insight and very little understanding of what is going on, as many of us are probably sharing, but it is an undeniable part of food news within the UK at the moment, and at this point it truly feels like while we had a decision in how this vote went, we're kind of all just swimming along waiting to see what wave comes next. So it will be interesting to keep an eye on how this all affects our little island over the next few months. In slightly cheerier news though, it is the time of year when a favourite returns to one of our high street coffee shops. It's PSL season, bitch. It's pumpkin spice latte season already, unbelievably. But it is upon us. Autumn is upon us. The weather is feeling a little bit autumnal. It's looking autumnal. Leaves are starting to change, and the pumpkin spice latte is back at Starbucks. So you may as well start writing your letter to Santa now, because it's all downhill from here. The pumpkin spice latte, of course, is an autumn favourite. It appears every year. I know it's a thing in the US, in Canada, in the UK. Let me know if you're from elsewhere and it's also a thing in your country. I thought this usually appeared in October, but it came as early as the 1st of September this year. Starbucks were striding straight into my emails with those marketing pitches of how many different shapes, sizes and formats one can consume a PSL in now. And while I'm not the biggest fan of them, there is always something a little bit nice about seeing it come back. It's just like, when you're hungry and you stumble across a McDonald's. It might not necessarily be the first thing you want, but it's always there. The corporate giant you can rely on for some manufactured comfort. The PSL, for the uninitiated, is, I believe in the UK, based on a mixture of pumpkin, sugary syrups, spices and flavourings, and it's then blended with a bit of espresso and a lot of milk and some squishy, squirty cream, and then a bit of spiced stuff on top. And the other piece of kind of corporate giant food news that did tickle me a little bit over the past month is the fact that the first ever Oreo cafe has just opened nowhere else, of course, than the United States. It has opened up, it says just outside New York City, but I believe it's actually somewhere in New Jersey. It's in a mega mall called the American Dream in Rutherford, New Jersey. That you couldn't make up a more stereotypically American news story. It could be fake, I love it. Anyway, as you can imagine, the inside of the store is just aggressively Oreo. There is not only the word and brand colouring everywhere of the white, the blue, the black, the sort of grey shades, and flavours and packs of Oreos, the cool kind of big American packs as far as the eye can see, but it also has like a giant, ominous, all-seeing black Oreo UFO suspended from the ceiling. Now, for scale, I can't really tell how big that is, but it's like something straight out of Disneyland. Like, it is massive. So I don't really know why this is only opening in 2021. The first ever Oreo cafe opening feels like something that should have happened decades ago. I mean, the Oreo was a huge kind of hit and trend in the UK about 10 years ago, so I can only imagine how bored Americans are of it. So this article sharing it was published on the 18th of August, and it lets us know that on the menu there are kind of Oreo desserts, waffle desserts, cookies and cream cheesecakes, Oreo cookie mousses, and you can make your own Oreo treats. And there's even more stereotypically, a secret menu available where you can kind of order something that isn't actually displayed on the menu. You can design your own Oreos. It's basically, if you like a chocolate biscuit, you're going to love it, but you're going to have to travel to Rutherford, New Jersey, for better or worse. But interesting, quirky, and entertaining, to say the least. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a food lover or even a cook. If you want exclusive digital recipe guides on subjects like the best way to make, bake, and eat cookies, or a cute little book of breakfast ideas, head to Maverick Baking's shop on Etsy. Funny food trends and some borderline absurd food news aside, I want to now get into the crux of this month's episode. Now, as I kind of said from the start, obviously, we don't have the cheeriest title going on today, but I think the subject is an important one, and it's one that I felt, if not now, I definitely needed to speak about in future to give a bit of insight into why I wanted to start this kind of podcast in the first place, why I got into food writing and food reviewing in the first place, and why food is such an intrinsic part of my very existence. And before doing so, I kind of anonymously asked you guys across social media, if you were comfortable, of course, sharing any experiences you had with any kind of disordered eating. Now, obviously, I kept and will continue to keep all of the responses anonymous, but all I can say is that a good amount of people responded, if not just kind of quietly saying yes, but not giving further detail, but also kind of giving me some insight into when any disordered eating in their life started, what it entailed, and what caused it. And I think it's such a taboo and bizarre segment of mental health still, even in 2021, that it's something I wanted to touch upon. And as someone who has incredibly fortunately not only managed to survive the horrors that these disorders can bring, but also managed to recover, I think, as much as fully possible, even just by the age of 25, I feel this kind of responsibility and urge to share what I've experienced and what I've learned, not out of any form of narcissism or self-congratulatory means, but because I relied and was so fortunate to be able to rely on the words of brave people online, on TV, in books, that it feels wrong for me not to do the same to anyone who may be listening or may listen weeks, months, or years in the future, if I can still be bothered making this podcast then. So going by the title, I ruined my own childhood with an eating disorder. Very bold, ostentatious even, but it's absolutely what happened. And any family members or friends at the time could back me up. And I want to share this first half of my life with you guys, and maybe follow up with what this eating disorder developed into when I was then a teenager and a very young woman, and how on earth we got out of it. But I wanted to start with the childhood element first, mostly because it makes sense chronologically. We all love an A to Z storyline. But also because I think it's something that's never really spoken about as openly as it should, because we don't think of eating disorders as something that can actually happen to children unless, they have the misfortune of having allergies, etc. In the age of mental health awareness that we're in, eating disorders are still as taboo as they are deadly. So here's kind of what it feels like to have had one forever, really. On the face of it, it does often feel like mental health is something we hear a lot about in Western society, and that it's no longer this unspoken horror or something that ends in lobotomy or straitjackets. There are books, movies, TV shows covering the subject, endless social media rampages. People tweet about their issues and feelings. Some dedicate entire social media platforms to helping others with issues that they've had. And even the corporate world has opened its heavy doors to the tolerance of mental struggles, if just to a small and arguably performative extent. The words depression and anxiety are commonplace in 2021, and we encourage people to open up and to talk and to check in on their mates, of course, which is incredibly important still. But we can often be guilty of doing this at the expense of other issues that are just as real and much, much more deadly. For example, how often do you see welcoming acceptance of schizophrenia, personality disorders, drug or alcohol addiction, or of eating disorders? I spent my entire childhood from the age of 7 onwards in the grips of a disorder I didn't understand, my friends didn't understand it, my family certainly didn't understand it, and even at the time it felt like a lot of doctors didn't really fully grasp or understand the severity of it. It's not because I was unique, it's not, I was no special case by any means, but as recently as 2005, problems like this were completely unspeakable, and even now, most of the help I've had as a teenager and as an adult was from strangers on the internet, which, that can go one way or the other. So here's a bit of a grim insight into it, really, and what this eating disorder I had was. Most eating disorders, if you were to ask the man on the street what an eating disorder was, they might say anorexia or bulimia. Those who perhaps are a bit more initiated in the subject might also talk to you of orthorexia or a binge eating disorder. Orthorexia being a fairly recently spoken about disorder, which is a kind of hyper focus on purely healthy foods, so not necessarily for the purpose of losing weight, but people will only eat foods they deem to be healthy, whether that means keto, whether it means vegan, anything like that. Very difficult to diagnose, but it became and has become a big problem throughout the 2000s and the 2010s. The anorexia issue and the bulimia issue being well documented, for better or worse, in media, and binge eating being something that often comes as part of all three. The other kind of disorder that's specified medically is known as EDNOS, EDNOS, or eating disorder not otherwise specified, which I have long loathed the title of, because even though I understand mental issues aren't exactly easily summarized, it doesn't exactly help when you already feel like a bit of a weirdo and you're given the title of something otherwise unspecified. It finally, after years of not really knowing what the hell was going on, kind of came to my family that the eating disorder I had stemmed from something called emetophobia. Emetophobia, I've only ever seen this word written down, I've never heard it said out loud. Now this, as defined, is a specific phobia that involves an extreme fear of vomiting, seeing vomit, watching other people vomit, or the feeling of nausea. Now, there will not be in-depth discussion of this, but if that is something that you do struggle with, while I would urge you to try your best to listen, to understand, and to push yourself out of your comfort zone, I also fully understand if it's something that you find upsetting or uncomfortable, and that this isn't something you want to listen to. So I'll just throw that in there now, because I know all too well how you feel. Nowadays you can Google this word and you'll find some articles on what it is, and that it's been linked to eating disorders for a number of years now in various shapes and forms, and it's also strongly linked to obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Now OCD is something that is often thought of as just related to an obsessive focus on hygiene and germ killing. It can lead to and from emetophobia, because, germs and sickness can be intrinsically linked. And OCD is something that, while mild, I did suffer from hand in hand with all of the other nonsense that was going on between my ears back then. It basically started, to give you some perspective, again, when I was about 7 years old. On paper, life was grand. I had lovely parents who, if you're listening, hi, in a happy marriage, happy household, decent lifestyle, nice wee house in Scotland, and I had a really close relationship with my best friend and his family. absolutely nothing you could sort of pick apart from my terrible eyesight, but that's just a lifelong affliction that we deal with. Everything was absolutely fine. I was a smart kid. I was having a good time generally. One afternoon in the summer of 2003, I think it must have been, my friend and I had been playing outside and eating sweets and just causing trouble as children do. And for whatever reason, whether it was some kind of stomach bug, whether it was, eating too much, running around too much sugar, or just one of those things that happens to small children sometimes, I got sick that evening. I vomited. And much like people joke about sort of remembering the day that their conscious mind kicked in, this is one of my moments. It was the first time in my kind of conscious existence that had happened. Long after the kind of milky cough-ups that my parents would have had to deal with when I was a really young child. And for some reason that I couldn't explain, and probably still can't explain to myself, it scarred me. It took a matter of seconds, but that little unpleasant few seconds was enough to literally change my entire life, which is normal, It happens in car crashes, it happens in explosions, it happens in sudden deaths and diagnoses of illnesses. I know that obviously people's lives can change in a matter of seconds all the time, but usually not with something so innocuous, really. There had been some other stuff going on when I was a kid. Everyone goes through deaths of family members and stuff like that, and not everything's always rosy, but this was certainly something that should not have rocked me as much as it did. And I became obsessed, basically. It became my mission, because I was and remain to this day a nerd who always has to have some kind of hyper focus. It became my mission for it to literally never let this nasty thing happen to me ever again, which is obviously ridiculous, and completely unrealistic, but that's how I felt. It was like being scared all the time. And I don't just mean, a little bit fearful or a little bit anxious. I mean shaken to your core, scared at the concept that this could happen. And as with anything that's linked to a fear of food or a disorder around food, it's so heightened because it's something you have to face at least 3 times a day. Unlike any kind of issues people often have with gambling or with sex or with drugs, there are ways you can distance yourselves from these things. When you have issues around food, while I'm not minimizing any of these other addictions or issues around food are so relentless because there's no way to distance yourself from what feels like the core of the problem. And basically I began kind of tailoring my life around this. I didn't have the internet back then, thank God. So I was restricted to just kind of word of mouth, ways that people got sick or prevented themselves from being sick. I learned about the concept of car sickness, and since then I've always sat and looked out the window of cars differently. I've focused on the kind of horizon point they tell you to so that you don't get nauseous, even though I don't really get car sick and never did. Some other things I did, I stopped eating full meals in case they were too much, because of course, it's a well-known trope, or, well, not a trope, it's just a fact that if you overeat too much in one sitting, you can upset your stomach. I stopped eating too quickly because I'd heard stories of that causing it. I stopped eating sweets and desserts because they often, if you eat too much, especially as a kid, because you don't really know your boundaries yet, they can lead to some pretty severe nausea. I didn't eat certain foods that made me feel full, whether that was kind of potatoes, tatties, rice, pasta, whatever. I didn't eat any new foods in case they caused some kind of reaction or in case I couldn't trust them. I, in connection with the OCD I mentioned earlier, began washing my hands over 20 times a day, I would say, potentially more, to ensure that there was just no chance of bacteria living on them whatsoever that could possibly make me sick. The OCD came in other forms, but we don't need to get in that here. I stopped exercising after eating because I heard that could cause an upset stomach. I stopped exercising ever because I realised that could also cause an upset stomach. I refused to eat in other people's houses eventually. The only places I would eat would be, I would eat my mum's cooking, my grandma's cooking, and my friend's mum's cooking. That was it. And it got to the point where basically you literally couldn't take me anywhere. You couldn't take me to get an ice cream. You couldn't take me to get a drink, or even fast food like Burger King. You couldn't take me to cafes, restaurants, anywhere. I just wouldn't eat, or I would kick off in the most confusing silent tantrum that my parents will probably ever experience, because I just wouldn't trust anything or anyone. And of course, because of this, it didn't take long before everyone noticed. Even though I was a fairly reserved and quiet kid, no one had any idea what to do, essentially. Sympathetic, confused, frustrated, embarrassed is what my family had to go through anytime they had to eat with me in private or in public. My mum had to kind of let my school know there were some issues. Turns out, I found out a few months later, I was not the only one. There were several other girls going through their own childhood eating disorders, but again, no one ever talked about this, which I now realise is a bit messed up, so that's what I'm trying to do here. And as I started to kind of suffer the physical side effects of basically not really eating anything that should sustain, let alone help to grow, a small child, medical professionals didn't really help much. And while I have the utmost faith in doctors, nurses, medical professionals, of course, and I've relied on the NHS various times in my life here in the UK, they were kind of unable to really do anything at this point, because back then, and even a little bit now, eating disorders is something you think of, that's what 16-year-old girls have, or that's what women in their 20s have, after they've had a baby. It's not something you think of a reasonably well-off child having to deal with. I remember I was prescribed medicine for acid reflux by one of the doctors, because they thought that it was a physical issue I was having, that I couldn't eat, or that I was being sick and vomiting. It just wasn't the case. It was really hard to explain, and I was a child, so I couldn't put my feelings into the words that my parents or my friends or any medical professionals needed. I couldn't explain it. At this point I was like 8 or 9 years old. I didn't have a clue what was going on. I knew what I didn't want to happen, being the vomiting, but everything else I knew I had to eat to live. I could barely explain anything else. And the concept of mental health, even though this was, again, 2004, 2005, you didn't talk about that kind of thing. You just saw it in movies sometimes. And it went on, as I said, for several years. I lost weight to the point my bones were visible through my skin. My cheeks were kind of noticeably narrowed. I mean, I don't have the fullest face, but as you can see, if you've ever seen me on video or in pictures before, or you're watching right now, I have a fairly kind of filled out face. It's a relatively round face. I have a defined jawline, but the rest of it's fairly plump, fortunately. So it was noticeable when I lost the weight. My skin kind of faded in the way that you see very ill people's skin fade. I'd always had quite kind of golden skin as a kid, because I was playing outside, and I have relatively dark features as it is. It became much, much whiter. My hair got darker, unbelievably. Kind of how your hair gets darker in winter if you're not in the sun so much. It was like that, just ramped up to 10. And you can see sort of the difference in my school pictures as a kid, going from, the age of like 6 up to 10. The fluctuation in my weight and my appearance, it's like two completely different children. It's horrendous looking at it now. But I didn't care at the time, obviously, because I didn't care about my looks as a child. I don't know how many children do. As long as I could control what I needed to kind of control, that was it. I wasn't really fussed about the rest. But, the worst part, obviously, was seeing how it affected my family, seeing how my poor mother had to deal with everything I put her through. And I laugh now because we've spoken about this so many times, and how I was an angel in all other elements of childhood. I was well behaved, I got good grades, but my God, I put her through it. And of course, the other major thing that it affects as a kid, when you're not really focused on body image, because you don't, it was pre-puberty, you're not even looking at your body, unless you've, cut yourself playing or something, or you've lost one of your many teeth that you lose throughout childhood. The main thing I always noticed was I had no energy. Not even that I was tired all the time, but I just couldn't be bothered doing anything. At the age of 8, the same lethargy that most people get 5 years into parenthood when they're in their mid-30s, but that was me as a child. I couldn't bring myself to do anything. There were days at weekends, I remember I would just sort of lie or sit on my bedroom floor, not really playing, not really reading, just sort of existing, all for the sake of controlling something that didn't even need to be controlled. Again, I poke fun at it now and how ridiculous the whole thing was, but it's the exact reason I think we need to do more of this kind of talking, because it is just all so bizarre in the abstract. How I kind of got out of it as a child, though, without wanting to delve too much into a couch therapy session at the moment. And of course, as much as I want to get into my teenage and adult issues and how I want to share what helped me from that perhaps in some later episodes, if you guys do enjoy this one. If not, obviously do let me know and we can get back to just making fun of people on TikTok and talking about bad ice cream flavors. But how I kind of got out of the childhood issues was a combination of tough love and understanding in equal measure, both ends of the spectrum. And while tough love for mental health isn't something you can really prescribe or recommend, because one person's description of tough love might just be telling you to get over it, deal with it, get out of bed, go and live. And obviously things are not that simple. In my case, I was told something by a family member that still rings in my head. I can even remember the very way they said it, the cadence of their words, where they were standing and how they were looking at me when they said it. And they said, if you don't start eating, your friends will be heading off to secondary school while you're lying in a hospital bed with an IV drip. And, not the way you might recommend someone speak to a 10-year-old at the time, but honestly, hearing that directly was one of the best things that happened to me in my life. It had been said in the heat of the moment. It's not the way that a family member or this family member would speak to me normally, but it had been said in the heat of the moment after me pushing food around my plate and, confusing conversations coming up about why I was pushing food around my plate. And of course, this was by no means an overnight cure. I didn't hear this and then go, okay, everything's fine now. But it replayed and continues to replay in my head whenever there are thoughts that creep into my head that maybe shouldn't be there. And it took time. It took a lot of personal willpower. I was an only child, which meant that I was always kind of more of an adult in the house than I was a baby or, one of a group of children. So I'd sort of had to sometimes pull myself up by the bootstraps and act like the people around me, which is difficult enough in any situation. Only children get a bit of a painting as spoiled kids, but we're not all like that. There were also regular silent crying episodes to my poor mother and constant kind of affirmations that it's fine, this is normal, that going out to eat at restaurants is normal, not washing your hands before every single thing you eat is normal and sometimes good. Everyone still watched what I ate, whether it was at school or friends, family members, my own family members. And there were a good, at this point, age 10, there was a good sort of 5 to 10 years, admittedly, where I had to physically and mentally battle my difficulty with the concept of regurgitation, shall we just say. And luckily, I have a fairly strong stomach, so it's something that never really happened to me. But I, for example, recall 2 instances where just seeing someone else vomiting brought on panic attacks when I was in a place where I didn't have kind of, the safety net of my family around me. One of which was on a bus when I was sitting next to someone and it happened. Now, a bizarre set of circumstances led to this. It wasn't just the fact we were on a bus. We were on a bus in South America on a 10-hour journey and they had eaten some dodgy food and they had a very weak stomach. A long list of things caused this issue, but it happened. And even though they were the one going through the unpleasant feeling and sensation of vomiting, I had a seriously kind of violent panic attack from this. And you can't just get off a bus, really. So I had to just kind of deal with it. Which again is not advice I'm giving to anyone to try and help them out of their issues, but sometimes there are little things in life that do just kind of, pardon my French, kick you up the arse to face the things you need to face. And that's something that worked for me, as horrendous as it was at the time. I didn't even get drunk for the first time until I was 23. I'm only 25 now. But it was that control. I didn't have control if I was inebriated or intoxicated or even a little bit tipsy. I was like, no, I can't control it. I can't control what I'm eating. I can't control what I'm drinking or how my body deals with it, because I'm not the one in charge. And it was that always led to this fear. And, eventually it just began to kind of fade out. And while eating disorders never leave you fully, now for some people that's not nice to hear, for others it's somewhat comforting, you can recover from it. You absolutely can. It takes so much mental gymnastics though, and there's nothing that can really be prescribed for it. Once you've gotten over the physical element of being able to gain the weight through whatever means, especially as a child, I know it's quite easy to do that. In fact, while I was able to gain the weight, even though both of my parents were 5'9", and their family members above them were even taller than that, I now, at the age of 25, a fully grown adult woman, I'm only 5'2", because I stunted my growth so much because of all this nonsense. So I have an eternal reminder of how much of a pain in the arse my brain is sometimes, but I can't emphasize enough how much work needs to be done by you or by the individual or you've heard of that has a disorder like this. There's nothing can be prescribed. There's no pill that helps numb things. There's no formal education that really gets you out of it. Of course there's therapy, there are people you can speak to that are professionals who are incredibly good at their jobs that can help. But eating disorders, because, as I said earlier, because of your constant exposure and physical requirement to eat, it just requires daily hard graft to even get yourself through it, let alone to get better. And that's kind of why I wanted to speak about it and to share, not only the kind of grim side of it, but the fortunate side of having only my height as the long-term effect so far. And, being able to look back and think, God, it was just a bit daft, some of the stuff I was doing. But of course, at the time, it's just so vital and important to your entire existence that you can't imagine life without that control. So, having been fortunate and having been able to get out of this side of my eating disorder journey, if you will, I will talk in future episodes, perhaps one immediately after this, perhaps we'll have a little break and go back to something a bit more lighthearted and get back into this meaty subject. My eating disorder did evolve as an adult, as a teenager and as an adult. I got a few years of a break from it, admittedly. But the manipulation, as I've said, mental gymnastics, the aversion, the sneakiness, all of the things I'd kind of learned as a child that this disorder teaches you to be a very good liar, that stuck and came back with a bang when I was a bit older. But we can talk about that in future. Today, I really just wanted to kind of give you guys an insight into what on earth it feels like, whether it feels like the most dramatic thing in the world on the inside and looks like the most ridiculous thing in the world from the outside. Eating disorders are still so misunderstood from both sufferers, professionals and, you know, the poor family members who have to help sufferers through it as well. They truly do affect so many people, and they're so difficult and so deadly that I think it can help to talk about these things, even if it is in a light-hearted, autobiographical kind of way. And while my recovery from at least my childhood issues comes from a lot of luck in the family I was born into and the support they were able to give me emotionally, but also from learning the really bloody difficult skill of doing it yourself, which isn't spoken about, and it might even be a bit controversial to say it, but I truly do think that's one of the biggest weapons you have. And I can't speak for all mental disorders, but in terms of something like this, when it comes to your own diet, your own body, and your own mind being affected so much by the same thing, there's a lot of painful personal responsibility that is difficult to talk about and even more difficult to deal with. But that's about it. That's about it for this chapter of my life. I hope this casts some clarity on why I feel so passionately about food and the unashamed and guilt-free enjoyment and love of food now that I am a grown woman, and why I'm always so outspoken with sharing my passion for this and sharing the importance of not punishing yourself and not controlling your diet beyond belief and having a healthy relationship with food, both physically and mentally, because until you've been through the mill, I don't think you can fully understand how much the stuff you put in your gob can affect your entire celestial being. So I hope this has been of help, or, you know, if you were just listening out of curiosity, I hope it's given you a bit of insight into what illnesses like this can be like. Feel free to share with me any questions you have, or if you're someone who has or continues to suffer from a disorder such as this, if you have a child going through a disorder like this, anything like that, any experience you have that you would like to talk about, to ask questions about, just to share with someone who's been through it too, I'm here. My emails are always open at maverickbaking@outlook.com, or through social media DMs, anything you like. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear how you're doing. I'd love to hear what you struggled with. And I really hope that this word soup of emotional nostalgia has brought something to you, if not just using up a lot of your time, because I've just realized I've probably been speaking for far too long. But I am going to wrap up there, my lovely people. Thank you so much, as always, for listening to the Sweet Nothings podcast. The nothings that I have been whispering in your ear this month, obviously a little bit heavier than usual. If you would like to go back to some lighter subjects, do not worry, they're coming back, and I have lots of things to muse and complain about in equal measure about the food industry that will be a little bit less dark than this one. But I just feel it's an important part of eating and the culture of eating that does need to be spoken about a little bit as well. But thank you, as always, especially if you've managed to listen this far, for listening, whenever you're listening, and I will speak to you next time.